com um tema, um tópico muito importante, que faz o casamento perfeito entre a parte de crime organizado e criminalidade económica, por isso peço a vossa atenção para esta sessão e para terem questões. But now in English. Hi everyone, my name is Pedro, and I have the great pleasure to share this conference with Tanya Wyatt. On behalf of the School of Criminology, I would like to welcome Professor Tanya Wyatt and thank her for giving a talk in this conference, which is organized by our research center. Tanya Wyatt holds a PhD in criminology, and she is a professor of criminology at the Northumbria University. She's expert in green criminology with a focus in wildlife crime and trafficking, non-human animal abuse and welfare, and works on the intersections with organized crime, corporate crime, and corruption. She's also interested in crimes of the powerful, particularly industrial agriculture and wider issues of the intersection of these topics deserves attention because the harm is huge. The loss of the biodiversity and the environment will negatively impact our society, welfare, and we need to talk about it. However, as Tanya and colleagues wrote very recently, it often feels like you are talking to a wall. It is the title of a recently published paper by Tanya and colleagues. Today, Tanya will present a communication. Thank you very much for your communication to be with us. The floor or the screen is yours. Go ahead.
Obrigado. Thank you very much for the invitation today, and happy 25th birthday to your center. That's amazing for criminology to be so resilient in different parts. We don't often see that. So that's fantastic. So yes, I am a professor of criminology at Northumbria University in the northeast of England, where, as I was saying earlier, it is pouring rain here today. So I'm glad you guys get to maybe enjoy some sunshine. But I'm here to talk today about wildlife trafficking and posing the question, is it a corporate crime? And from my work, about 15 years in this field, I've raised this question because colleagues and I have been discovering that often in this space, wildlife trafficking gets talked about as simply organized crime or simply a consequence of poverty, and the nuance and the complications around who are these actors that are actually involved often gets ignored. So I'm going to first just give a brief overview about wildlife trafficking in case people are unfamiliar with it, and then some of the research around corporate crime. What is it when I say that? What am I talking about? And then making the case of the link between these two. So wildlife trafficking sits at this nexus of legal trade. There's a huge portion of wildlife trade that is perfectly allowed, completely legal across the world. But at the same time, what we see happening, and you guys are probably all aware of a biodiversity crisis, it often gets called the sixth mass extinction. And why scientists are talking about it this way is because the rate of extinction has increased and humans are responsible for that. So E.O. Wilson, a biologist, has said that the extinction rate is now 100 to 1,000 times higher than it would be in other situations where we've seen extinctions in the past. Now, the main cause of species extinction is habitat loss, also caused by humans, where we're deforesting, changing wetlands, land use change, all of these sources of habitat loss. But as a recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, so IPBES, you can see there on the second point, has found that the second cause of extinction is overexploitation, which includes poaching and what I'm going to focus on talking about, wildlife trafficking, or the international illegal wildlife trade. Often too, what we see in the media, and I'm sure we've all seen coverage of elephant poaching for ivory, probably rhinoceros for their horns. Maybe we start to see a pangolin, which is the scaly mammal that's come into attention recently. But what we need to understand about wildlife trade and trafficking is it is the entire web of life. every kind of species are targeted for consumption. Now that means arachnids, insects, fungus, plants, trees, the whole species spectrum. And also what gets covered that can be misleading, I think, in the media is that this is a problem in Africa or maybe a problem in Asia. And really it's the whole world that is impacted by this. And I and colleagues have written about who really gets overlooked in talking about wildlife demand are Europe, which is a huge consumer of wildlife, as well as the United States. And a recent report, so the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime produces this really excellent now World Wildlife Crime Report. And in 2020, if you look at that, the US just outstrips everybody for wildlife consumption. There's a huge amount going in there. And so there's a real complicated nature around source, which is in our biodiversity hotspots, but really also in other areas too that have rare and wildlife in demand, complicated networks of transit all across the globe. We see that here in the UK, which is a huge transit zone, Heathrow being one of the biggest airports in the world, species, wildlife coming in and out of here and going to other places, and then demand. And that's where the EU and the US really need a lot more attention in terms of what's happening in this space. And when I say trafficking, just to be clear, it's a huge process. It isn't just that transit movement. It would be all of these steps of trade if they are illegal. So collection, harvesting, possession, wildlife, as I'll talk about, it needs to be processed. It has to be advertised. And I'll talk a little bit about the huge role now of the internet and online spaces for advertising. People have to acquire the wildlife. It has to be transported. So there's import, export, the selling, the bartering, the exchanging. So it's a very complicated and very long process. And I should say too that colleagues and I have criticized the language that gets used in this field. You'll see it's a very instrumental kind of language. So I'm talking about collecting, like I would collect my post, or I would harvest something, where what we really need to understand here is we are talking about suffering and harm, death. Colleagues like Piers Byrne or Ragnar Soland, Jenny Meyer in the audience there would talk about this as murder. It could be considered a kind of murder, that we think we speak in other language because they're non-human animals and not humans, but really what's behind all of this. So to make it illegal, so illegal wildlife trade, wildlife trafficking being synonymous or interchangeable, are violations, I argue, administrative, civil, criminal. It's a violation. It doesn't just have to be criminal. And that could be falsification of permits, violating of quotas. And then I think we've got to talk too about welfare violations and other kinds of harms that often get ignored. Now, we know less about the scope of wildlife trafficking. We know that wildlife trade, the legal part of it, is absolutely enormous, with billions of wildlife being traded every year. As you guys will know as criminologists, there's this dark figure, right? There's things that we just don't know about things that are illegal. And I would argue, and colleagues have argued, that for environmental crimes in general, and possibly for wildlife trafficking in particular, there's likely a huge figure of dark crime because of the nature of victims. They're silent, they have no voice. If you're wildlife and you can't speak about your victimization, or I should say can't be understood, I would argue wildlife probably do have communication. And the often isolated spaces, remote areas where wildlife are living, the fact that it's not a priority for law enforcement, the way that data is recorded by law enforcement, means there's a lot going on that's illegal that we just don't know about. And there's huge speculation as to how much we actually do know. And there's some estimate that maybe, we know 10, maybe 20% of the actual scope is going on. But it is hundreds of millions of plant and animals. And again, this very instrumental language that gets used of specimens rather than wildlife or individuals. And that type of language is even used in the main international treaty around wildlife trade, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. They refer to wildlife as specimens even. And if you've read anything in this space, you'll know that there's lots of numbers flying around about how much profit is in this for criminal organizations. And the one that often gets thrown out there is wildlife trafficking is the fourth most profitable black market in the world. And these kinds of numbers, just these estimates are very unsourced. We don't know where people are actually gaining these numbers from. I think the most sort of in-depth discussion of this lately has been a World Bank report in 2019, where it kind of lays out where some of these estimates have come from. So Interpol has done some estimates, the Global Financial Integrity Unit have done some, but the range is huge of how much they think that the illegal portion of this is probably worth. It gets, if you include timber and you include fish, then you're talking, 200 billion at the upper end of probably what this is worth. But in this World Bank report, they actually talk about, if you look at profit and accompanied by ecosystem services, so what are these natural resources producing and contributing to humankind's businesses, then we're talking somewhere in the range of $1 trillion to $2 trillion. So it's absolutely enormous if you could factor in the costs of what a loss of wildlife actually has on, and again, a very human kind of approach to it, but onto human businesses and human livelihoods. So we are talking, it is one of the most profitable black markets, but that's just a portion of it. And frankly, we talk about, that might be important, but I don't think that's necessarily the only reason why we should be concerned about this, is about how much it's worth. There's so many other important significance to why wildlife trafficking needs to be stopped. And I've proposed that the demand behind this, so I mentioned, the US and the EU in particular, but demand is really all over the world. And I originally had, in 2013, the book I wrote, Wildlife Trafficking, I proposed these categories of demand. And I just sent it to the publisher yesterday, my update. So here's my update on what this looks like. But we've got, I argue around, there's really 4 big drivers about demand. People are collecting things, you can see on the right of your screen there. That might be pets or companion animals, rare specimens for some kinds of collections. Zoos and laboratories are a part of this though. And I think the laboratories have really come to light during COVID, because there's been a massive demand for monkeys, horseshoe crabs, and other types of wildlife that are used in medical research and in vaccine production. A push for food, so bushmeat or wild meat is maybe more accurately called, seafood, but wildlife restaurants that are serving luxury kinds of products. Traditional medicines, we hear a fair amount in the news. So different parts of animals and plants getting made into powders or different forms of medicine. And then all these processed commodities, as I call them. So wildlife gets turned into a lot of different things for us, right? Fur coats, leather, timber products, other kinds of textiles and furniture. And then in the Venn diagram, you can see at these intersections, there's a lot of overlap here, where ivory, for instance, it has to be processed, but it's also a collector's item, for instance. So we've got lots of different types of demand. And that's another reason I think why we have a huge dark figure in terms of wildlife, is because the demand is so incredibly diverse. How do police and conservationists and other people worried about wildlife trafficking keep track of this diversity and chart and keep an eye on all these patterns and trends of what's going on? Moving on, though, to talk about the other elements to what I wanted to share with you guys today. So we have this wildlife trafficking going on, and where do businesses fit into all of this? So a colleague and I at Northumbria, in our book Crime and Power last year, talk about what are corporations. And we argue, any business or company registered in their own or another country's territory. So it doesn't have to be this big transnational, mega ginormous kind of business. It is just simply a company, and it could just be a few people that own it. And then we drew really heavily on, maybe you guys are familiar with Frank Pierce or Steve Toombs, Stephen Box as well, and their great work around corporate crime and trying to define what that is. And it is illegal. They're arguing illegal acts, but also omissions. And again, this isn't just criminal kinds of omissions or actions, but administrative and civil as well. And probably in the corporate sphere, at least in the UK, more likely to be administrative than civil, because corporations aren't often criminalized, as you guys will know. And I think some of the great work that Pierce and Toombs talk about in particular is around, could we go so far as to even say that there is a criminogenic nature to corporations? What is the organizational norms within corporations? And I don't think we can generalize that across, but we do need to kind of unpack that and try to explore what are the normative goals in some of these places? What are standard operating procedures? And are they always trying to cut corners, trim, margins for profit? What are the cultural norms that they're operating under? And Pierce and Toombs, in their great work around health and safety crimes in particular, have found that, that all corporations are really trying to cut corners and trying to make as much money as possible. And if that means blurring that line between legal and illegal, we are going to see that. But it's often quite invisible, very well hidden, and then probably not prosecuted, probably not punished. So how does that fit then in with wildlife trafficking? So last year, my colleagues, Don Manoom and Angus Nurse, we proposed that we should be thinking in the wildlife trafficking space around corporate crime groups. So it's been talked about for years in wildlife trafficking that there's these networks that are all involved, and it often gets talked about as organized crime. But what you start to see, and I'll talk more about in just one second, is that corporations are also forming part of these supply chains, illegal supply chains, in ways that are moving. And they are collaborating with individuals, but collaborating with outside groups as well. And that might be organized crime, could be even state actors sometimes. And that is to commit illegal activities that are in benefit of that corporation and those people that are running that corporation. And so we're proposing in that article that there is an aspect of corporations that are forming networks that are not so dissimilar to organized crime, that we should really be looking to compare these much more closely, that organized crime groups, how we see them being structured, that there's probably a real overlap into how corporate crime might be operating. What we suggest is that corporate crime how is it similar or dissimilar to organized crime? And one of those factors is it is highly organized. So corporate crime is just as structured, we would say, as organized crime. So if you have an already existing supply chain that involves the wildlife industry, that is very structured, and it isn't so hard necessarily to add on an illegal element to that that's going to be operating at the same time. We do think, though, probably corporate crime is less opportunistic. So because a corporation is acting within a particular industry, it probably doesn't necessarily come across, just the spontaneous kind of exposure to acting in a different criminal sphere. So there's less opportunity maybe to diversify the kind of criminal activity they're involved in, which means there's probably less links to other forms of criminality, which obviously in corporate crime, in organized crime, we see much more often, where there's links to various kinds of trafficking. So if you're an organized crime group trafficking, maybe you're trafficking wildlife, drugs, and various other things, or engaging in money laundering and those sorts of criminality activities too. And we think that for corporate crime, there's going to be some amount of corruption. So just one example I know from my own research in Russia, and this has been some time ago now, but I did come across corrupt employees of businesses who were involved in this. So train conductors, bus operators, people working for airlines that were facilitating wildlife trafficking by taking bribes or opening these paid corridors, as they get called, for wildlife to actually move. So that takes us back to the categories of demand. So I think I've been speaking a bit abstract about corporate crime and wildlife, and I just want to really be specific about what that then looks like. So if you look at this figure, all of these elements have businesses within them somewhere. So if you look at processed commodities, for instance, again, if I refer to my own research done in Russia, you have a legal and frankly enormous fur industry. And what that means is that not only do you have the trappers who are collecting the fur, who are individuals, maybe self-employed, but then you have all of these businesses along there that are involved in that. So you have the people that are preparing the furs through tanning. You have the manufacturers who are making those furs into coats or hats. And then you have this auction house in St. Petersburg where all of this is getting sold. And so there's clearly businesses in this wildlife industry. And as my participants in that study said, they know that there's illegality going on in there, because you get to that final stage where people are buying the furs at the St. Petersburg auction, and there's tens of thousands more furs than there should be because they've already exceeded their quota. So somewhere along there, those businesses have been turning a blind eye to illegality, or it's getting laundered through there somehow. We see that in other spaces too, though. If we look at ivory, for instance, the market around carving ivory, carvers, I would argue, have to know that's illegal. Domestic markets for ivory have now closed, essentially. So even Thailand and China have closed those off. So to have ivory and not have really sort of foolproof evidence that that ivory is from 1960 or sometime when it was allowed means that the business probably knows that they're engaged in some kind of illegality. And we could argue very similarly on all of these cases. But for any of this wildlife to get processed, to get sold, there's going to be a company involved. So I think it makes a strong case of why we have corporate crime probably involved. And I think some of the biggest evidence comes from my colleague that I mentioned earlier around Don Van Oom's work around caviar, is that there's even a whole parallel trade in fraudulent caviar tins made by companies putting in the caviar, which caviar is a funny one because they're lying that farmed caviar is wild caviar because people like it wild better. So kind of reverse to what we would expect. That those tins are even part of this. And so you have logos and an infrastructure all, by these companies supporting this kind of illegality. So everywhere along here, I suggest there's businesses that are actually getting involved. And I think a really good example of this comes from the pet industry. So the 4 photos that you can see there were taken at the Heathrow Animal Reception Center. So I had a visit there several years ago, where all wildlife in the UK is supposed to come in and be checked. And so they have a CITES team there that actually does the exploration into the wildlife. They do all the inspections that are coming in. And that in the upper left there that you will see is a shipment that they got in from Florida the day that I managed to visit. And if you can imagine, this is a 1 meter by 1 meter crate, and each of those boxes has a live reptile, amphibian, or something or other in there. And they've probably 2 days maybe that they've been stuffed in here, going to the Miami airport, getting loaded on this plane, being in cargo, which we know is problematic for reptiles, being in freezing cold spaces and in a cargo hold. getting shipped out and arriving at Heathrow, where hopefully, it doesn't take too long for the veterinarians who were the inspectors when I were there opening up and having a look. Now, they thought that this shipment was probably fine. They only contacted the company who had sent it to mention that they should be more careful about how much space these reptiles have. So the chuckwallas in the middle of the screen, they thought were too crammed in. So if you can imagine, these two reptiles are just in an Amazon book box, so maybe a bit too tight. And then the bottom right there, you can see some red ear terrapins, and the air transportation rules say that they each need to have their own space to be able to stand and to walk around. And you can clearly see that they couldn't, that they were all stacked upon each other in these little takeout boxes. So, I mean, I think there's two things there. First, that there's some wildlife welfare issues here, and the approach of the border force and the team that's doing that is not to immediately jump to holding the company in any kind of violation, but it's a negotiation and a kind of trying to get them to be compliant by speaking to them rather than immediately going to any sort of formal process. But I think it leads to an industry. So they're also checking these boxes because if you can imagine how many dozens of animals are in here, they need to look at every single one to know if that animal is legal or illegal. Because of the way that it's packed, they need to do a lot of checking. And the book there on the screen, it's older now, but worth a read if you're interested in the reptile and pet industry. So Brian Christie is a journalist who often writes for National Geographic. He had actually visited the business where this shipment had come from, and he mentions it specifically in his book of them often mixing legal and the illegal and just seeing if they can get it through. And as I mentioned, around sort of organizational deviance or criminogenic nature of organizations and businesses is engaging this kind of behavior where you put some illegal in with the illegal because you know, well, first, you're probably not going to get caught because the amount of inspections are very low. And it's, there's so much to inspect, chances are you might be able to sneak something through. So risk is low. But then secondly, the fine, if you get one, is also going to be very low. You're probably just going to be told off though, like I said, some kind of negotiation or compliance talk. But if you do get a fine, that fine is so low, it is not going to impact on your profits as a company. And we see that in the corporate crime sphere all the time, particularly around pollution and environmental violations, that fines are so minimal, it does not impact on a company's profit at all. And we see that in wildlife as well. So, these reptiles are each selling for hundreds of euro. So the fine isn't going to impact on what they've earned for that at all. And that's the legal element. And the picture on the right is probably one you guys might have seen in the news. The other thing to do is in the pet industry is just to outright smuggle. And you hide things on your body or in your luggage and hope that customs isn't gonna find you with all of these eggs or other kinds of wildlife that are strapped and hidden on your person. But that feeds into the legal industry. So we see that individuals who are smuggling have relationships with not only pet stores, which maybe in Europe and the UK in particular, becoming much, much less often or less common, right? Pet stores seem to be a bit on the way out. But also, if I'm not sure, maybe you guys could tell me if Portugal has these huge reptile fairs. So the two biggest ones are in Hamm in Germany, and there's another one in Houten in the Netherlands. And we just had one here in the UK in the Midlands, where it'll just be 3 days of tens of thousands of reptiles in these takeaway boxes for sale in a convention center. And you have individuals attending these, but again, you have all of these businesses coming, and there's some good research happening around there about all of the sort of behind the scenes or backdoor trades of illegality that are happening in these spaces. And again, it's this legal illegal interface that we see quite clearly for particular kinds of wildlife trafficking, for sure. Just a few final thoughts before I open it up for questions, because I'd love to hear from all of you guys. So I mentioned that Don and Angus and I suggest that there's a lot of overlap. So we have these really complicated supply chains with businesses going on. But I could use ivory as an example where they think that there's a very significant organized crime, corporate crime overlap, whereas we have individuals probably poaching the ivory. It's suspected in places like Uganda and Tanzania that organized crime groups then consolidate all of those elephants, that ivory that was poached, into a single shipment, and that it's organized crime that is then managing to get it probably through Hong Kong or Singapore into China or mainland China. And then it's going into businesses to get carved and to made into things. So there you have this relationship between organized crime and corporate crime, probably. And then maybe you guys have come across the idea of disorganized crime. So here's where we have these individuals that are parts of these networks. They're acting on their own, they're self-employed, but they're linked in maybe at a point to organized crime or to corporate crime. So they know somebody in the pet industry and they'll smuggle birds or smuggle reptiles and get them into the pet industry. So the disorganized crime is a concept from Reuter in the 1980s, where he talks about it isn't organized, but it is absolutely structured. And so he's come up with this idea of disorganized. So whereas we do have distinctions between what is organized, what is corporate, and what might be this disorganized, these can be fluid, and we have people probably shifting roles or moving into these different spaces. But we came up with this, or we're arguing for this, because often we think the wildlife trafficking narrative gets simplified, and it is incredibly complex. And we hoped that this would capture it more, which hopefully would be beneficial to law enforcement and to efforts for prevention, disruption, and even around prosecution, about how we're holding people responsible. So around these criminal networks, we think that, so again, it's not homogenous, but maybe we can start to see some patterns that would help us to understand when we might see that it's organized, or when we might think that there's corporations involved. And I mentioned around, we probably see corporate crime to some degree, and organized crime certainly, becoming attracted to wildlife trafficking because of low risk of detection and then low fines or low sentences. So why not do something illegal that's less risky if you're involved and able to? And where do we see poaching? Well, we do have to worry about areas that probably have weak governance, particularly if it is a biodiversity hotspot. So these regions, and we see this in particular probably in some places in Africa, but a lot more attention is being given to Latin America now. So throughout South and Central America, where we see, obviously it's the most biodiverse place on Earth around the Amazon basin, and areas there that are unable to police that or don't have very particularly strong legal governance over wildlife and these spaces. I think one of the main points is where we see the overlap between, well, I was saying legal and illegal, but we could also talk about the underworld and the upper world that often gets talked about in the organized crime literature. So these symbiotic relationships is in so many spaces, the upper world or the legal world, it just provides an aspect where that illegal can just blend in. So you have this parallel operation of illegality along with the legal. And again, I think we see that in the pet trade, but we can really also talk about the timber trade is a huge one where we see this happening. Rising global scarcity of wildlife. As this biodiversity crisis increases, we see more extinctions. So I mentioned that intergovernmental panel talking about wildlife trafficking being the second cause of extinction. What that report also found is that there are 1 million species facing extinction in the next 10 years. And what is that going to mean for wildlife trafficking is that you're going to have certain species of wildlife with decreasing numbers and populations. And what you guys will probably know as well as I do, and for black markets, that means they're going to be worth more money as they become more rare and more scarce. And so are we actually going to see an increase of these different things because of the ongoing extinctions and scarcity? So we could see more transnational criminal organizations getting involved in this. And so we do think that that's why it's important to know all of these different actors, because chances are we're going to continue to see an increase of this kind of crime, which maybe you can tell, I'm very passionate about this because this is different to me than other black markets, because drugs is one thing, or firearms, which are awful, but for wildlife, the consequences are much more significant and lasting, and going to have much more severe consequences than other kinds of black markets, because we are talking about extinction, which is important, and why I do it about the wildlife, but it also has huge human consequences as well. I'm going to stop there, but I would love to take any questions that you guys might have.
Okay, thank you very much for your great presentation. And now we can discuss your issues with all the people inside this conference meeting. I don't know if there are already questions. We have already here a question or a comment. I don't know if Tanya is able to read it. Antónia Amorim, Faculdade de Ciências, Science Faculty of the Portal.
Thank you, Antonio. So you're asking about the forensic part of CITES, and CITES only dealing with cross-border and international crime. And these are many times poorly defined, preventing efficient production of DNA and genetic evidence. So thank you for that. And thanks for coming, Antonio. I'm pretty critical of CITES. I think it is an amazing achievement that it exists. It is 45 years old now, though, and I think myself and others have started to realize that it is fairly limited. And I think you point to an excellent part of that limitation is it really hasn't evolved to capture the differences in technology that exist now from 45 years ago, and that it is very limited in terms that it is only international. And I'm actually just helping with a bit of research in Brazil, and what we're finding there is that there's a huge amount of domestic trafficking going on. So within the country of Brazil, just massive amounts of demand for pets and songbird competitions and these sorts of things. And you're right, CITES does nothing to help with that. So I think, it doesn't deal with the cross-border, and and who is protected in CITES is so limited. You might have heard these numbers recently. So CITES only has about, and they don't even quite know how many species they have, which is another problem, that just over 38,000, but there's 8 million species on the planet. So it is very limited in its scope.
Rita, go ahead. Do you have a question? Yes.
Thank you. Tanya, considering that many of our participants are criminology students in their last year, and they'll hopefully soon become practitioners, where do you see criminologists, where do you see that criminologists have an opportunity in the field, to help prevent or fight wildlife trafficking?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess it depends on what kind of work you are going to go into. So I'm sorry, I don't know about the Portuguese system, but at least here
obviously,
in the UK,
but overall, obviously,
yeah. If you were becoming a police officer for being a criminologist in the UK, each of our constabularies do have wildlife crime officers, and it would be amazing to have people in those positions that actually have more in-depth understanding and knowledge about the topic, because the people that are there now are learning it later, which is fine, and they're fantastic and passionate about it, but it does help to have some of this background knowledge of all the complicated nature of it and complex nature. And similarly, in the customs and border is a good place to go, where wildlife, you could make a difference for wildlife trafficking, where if you had knowledge about it. But that's just in the law enforcement sphere. I would definitely encourage people to look at charities and NGOs. Rita, you were mentioning earlier around the bird one, or we have those here as well. So the Environmental Investigation Agency, Traffic, WWF, these are important actors in all of this who are also trying to stop wildlife trafficking. So, and I would really advocate for that, because I think there's a huge need for social scientists to be involved in this discussion, because often often who's driving the prevention and disruption are conservationists, and that's fantastic. They know so much about populations and reproduction of different species and their extinction threat and things, but we're the experts about what's going to change people's behavior and what's going to get people from not committing crime again, and the links to poverty and social injustice and all these other intersections that we see in wildlife trafficking. So I think, get out there. Social scientists have a big part to play in this discussion.
Okay, any questions? I have a question to put in this room, this virtual room. So, well, we are talking about business. Something it is illegal. A business, it works on the market, when we can find an intersection between supply and demand. Perhaps most of your communication was based on supply. Supply, the bad guys were on the supply side. But, well, when we think about how to fight this, the solution to fight this type of crimes, we can think in both sides. Firstly, on supply side, thinking in the deterrence instruments, fines, more control, more frontiers, control, etc., etc., etc. But I don't know, because we are in the market, and the price of the animals, the pets, everything is dependent on the intersection between supply and demand. Perhaps the one of the most important solutions for our society will be to focus on the demand side. We need to decrease the demand, because if we decrease the demand, the huge, those higher expected profits will not take place. So this industry will change, and the bad guys will go to some place over the world, not the wildlife traffic. I don't know what to think about this. Try to motivate society on the demand side, because I think that the fighting of the supply side is a very, very difficult task, because we can put in place rules, regulations, laws, but you need to control behaviors. You need to control huge areas of wildlife. For example, I am thinking about Amazonia, for example. Amazonia is a very huge area, and the control instruments for that huge area is very few. So it is impossible to control that. It is impossible to apply the law. It is impossible to make the law enforcement. So I think that the only solution for this world is to motivate society in order to decrease buying some type of pets, reptiles, and so on, so on, so on. So what do you think about this?
I think you're 100% right, Pedro, that demand, and that's why I started with mentioning the EU and the US, they have a the exact thing that you're saying to do. There need to be massive demand reduction campaigns in those spaces, because that's where a lot of pets are going, and trinkets and souvenirs and collector's items. And I do think you're right that it is so much about demand. And linking into that, I was going to speak a bit about, I think there's a role too for the internet and online companies owning up to how they're facilitating all of this. So we see eBay, Facebook not cracking down on people who are selling wildlife online and advertising it. And so I think that links into demand. I think you're right. We've got to get people to reduce their demand. We don't need reptiles in our homes. So yes, that's got to happen. But then I think you in terms of the business angle, I think we need to also, and there are movements in this. So there's a coalition to end online wildlife trafficking that Facebook and Google and these companies are involved in. So they are trying to do that. But I mentioned this project in Brazil that I'm helping out with, and what they're finding there is just WhatsApp is impenetrable and pervasive, and they are probably like 700 WhatsApp groups all devoted to people wanting a pet. And how does law enforcement deal with that? You're right. So you've got to cut the demand, otherwise you're really not going to have much impact.
I just like to complete the question about Amazon, because I think law there is a little thing, because they are killing native people every day and burn protected areas. I'm actually a native of there, and law, it's a little thing there, because there's not a fiscalization, and the government don't care at all about this. I think the world should care more about there, because the people are talking or asking for help, and it's not helping coming. And I think it's a little bit more of just patch or traffic. Obviously, it's important, but they're killing people for, I actually don't know the word in English. There's garimpo, it's about gold and...
Miners, Teresa, right? Miners, so the garimpeiros, right?
Yeah.
Miners, yeah.
Yes, and it's a huge question. And I think the world should care more, and because the government don't care about this.
Thank you for sharing, Teresa. I completely agree. And yeah, thank you for pointing out that there is this element around illegal mining that features in environmental crime, which is really devastating, and the loss of life of indigenous people and environmental activists in Latin America, I think, is really frightening and should get a lot more global attention.
Rita, please.
I don't know if I may, because what Teresa was also mentioning, from what I know, is also how organized crime uses violence when exploring nature via wildlife trafficking or overexploitation of resources or biodiversity. So organized crime, it's in the selling process and in the trade process, but it can also be using violence, killing, extortion, threats. In this case, in Brazil, against indigenous communities, which is obviously very serious. So I don't know, Tanya, if you also have this notion, or if this is something that you also would like to add. Well, in this way, we step away from the corporate crime probably, but organized crime in itself also may have this more aggressive, roots.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Rita, and that's an excellent point. So in the article I mentioned where we're talking about differentiating these networks, one of the elements we do mention around organized crime being distinct is their use of violence. But I think you've hit on to something that's really not been researched, or is a real gap in knowledge about the violence used in the commission and at that early stage. And we have, there's some brief stuff coming out about the exploitation of Indigenous and local communities by these networks. And I think that's something to further explore, because it's obviously very serious.
And more than that, I would talk about the case that happened in the city that I used to live. Now I live in Portugal. A man, he burned a car, and this burned a protected area on Petrópolis, on Rio de Janeiro, and he's free. He should be locked 15 years, but he wasn't, and now he's free. And he killed a lot of animals and a huge area, and now he's free. And nothing will be doing about this.
Yeah, and I know I had 2 years ago I wrote a paper with other colleagues from biology. It was related to Amazonia, and because of that paper, I found lots of information about the business inside Amazonia, and I found that in that occasion that the bad guys are from outside. They are from outside Brazil, but they have the compliance and the agreement of local authorities and the central authorities, mainly President of Brazil, and so on, so on, so on. They are all involved in this kind of agreements, international agreements with international corporations from Europe. Okay, they are exploiting trees. They cut the huge areas of trees, and they plant immediately other kinds of the plants. Because the areas are very huge, the control is made by helicopter and planes. So they control all areas from higher altitude. So what they need to see is green areas. So they cut all the trees to business, and they plant some type of species that grow very, very, very rapid, and fulfills those areas with green color. So, but behind those kind of exploitations are corporations from Europe. So when we are going to buy some things for our homes, we need to take into account this, because perhaps we are going to buy things that were made with the products of that kind of business, tree business, inside Brazil, Amazonia mainly. So I think that we need, as I said already, we need to focus on demand, because it is the key for this kind of problem. Sorry for this.
No, thank you. Yeah, Pedro, I think that you're right about also, so not just the active illegality or irresponsibleness of pets, but also that what you might be talking about of, if you're buying furniture at IKEA or somewhere that might not be resourcing responsibly, or palm oil, or all of these other things that we need to worry about. But yeah, not only do we need to cut demand, but when we do buy things, we've got to be good consumers and find out where things are coming from. But I think you also raise a great point around the state. And I think the state role in all of this needs to be looked at much more. And I think Emerson sort of touches on that, about actions of government officials inciting this. And all of you will know more about the Brazilian case than I do, but I think we see that in other spaces around in Cambodia, in Myanmar, where the government has kind of been actively involved in the past, at least in deforestation and giving permits to timber companies that they are then profiting off of. So yeah, I think in certain places, I think governments do have a lot to they are big actors in wildlife trafficking too, probably.
More comments, please.
Yes, I think Anju, that might be a tagline from WWF a few years ago. If the buying stops, killing stops, or at least they stole it, maybe. But yeah, I think that's very true.
I don't know if I'm controlling the chat, but I don't see any comments, additional comments here. Tanya, there is another. Is there any work in Nepal or South Asia?
I haven't worked in Nepal or South Asia, but I know you might read the work of, I think his surname is Kumal, but they worked, Gary Potter was one of the criminologist who was the co-author on that. And they've done one of the few, I think that I've only found 3 studies where they actually went into prisons and interviewed wildlife traffickers in Nepal, which I think is a great piece of work to read and really insightful as to what they were finding. That obviously there's the element of subsistence kind of poachers, the people who were poor and trying to make more money. But there is what I think we've come to understand more of, people that are just opportunistically doing it and just trying to, who aren't starving and who aren't poor necessarily, but are making extra money. But then I think some really other insightful things out of Nepal are about the peer pressure that goes on from family or other people in your village to pressure people into actually poaching or to storing illegal wildlife for people. So that's an interesting one to read, and Reed is on it, giving you the link there because she's speedy. Yeah, so and there is some work in India, but these are areas that are definitely maybe less explored than others.
Can I wait?
I should say, oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, because there is the lawn is being cleaned around here, so there is a lot of noise, so I was writing it down. So now now the guy seems to have been gone, taking a pause, so I just thought, like,
please, yeah.
small time frame. Yeah, but like you said, I think there is a different factor apart from peer pressure or the socio-cultural factor. I think it's I would say, like, I'm from Nepal, and I would say that if you have read the news, I think this year, around 2-3 months ago, there was a news that we have doubled the number of rhinos, and even last many years ago, like last year, we have doubled the number of tigers. That is being, like, as per our, like, apart from the, like, let's talk about the cultural part, the society part. I think the society is very strong on preserving these animals, and every single citizen feel very proudly and associated with these animals as a national pride. So that was one factor which was created from, like, I don't know, like 50-60 years ago when we are in high school. They taught us that this rhino, example, one-horned rhino, is a property of Nepal, and it belongs to every citizen of Nepal. So I think that part of association from your childhood with the animals, with forest, and with this part, like, naturally you get oriented in that direction. So that part was there. But I think in one aspect, what I think, in my opinion, is that it's not the socio-economic factor or the factors of peer pressure, but I think this is governed by a syndicate. Let's say a syndicate. It is governed by a syndicate. Now this syndicate is operated by top officials instead of poor people. I think that like, I don't know if you could understand the moral or not, but what I'm trying to express is, it's not the poor people in Nepal or countries like Nepal, because they are very associated of preserving the resources, but it's the syndicate that is hiring people to kill for them. And this, like what you said, like this is not for money. This is not for, this is not to improve their living standard. It's just for like getting more power. Like when you get associated with the syndicate, you get more power of freedom. Like you can do whatever you want. That part, I think, that part is what, because lately as a model, I would take Nepal as a model when I'm currently working in this this application of using solar drone in anti-poaching and wildlife, this part. So what I have seen when I am reading about Africa and Nepal, when I read about these two countries in Africa and Nepal, I find that in Africa, there is seriously a lacking of socio-economic standard where these people live. So there is a possibility these people are killing animals to get their lively. There is a huge possibility of that. But in countries like Nepal, let's say Nepal or India, India, I cannot say for every reason, but yes, in general, if I have to generalize and say that this is not about money, but it's more about power. So you are associating with yourself to power. And this power is coming from higher rank officials. This power is coming from there are a lot of NGOs, INGOs trying to preserve the resources. But still, if you see that, but how come there is a crime being happening there? Like you are investing millions of dollars and still there is a possibility of crime being conducted there. So if you see the money is flowing in a channel, in a way of syndicate, that they have like diverted the money in such a way that they receive to protect and they receive to kill. So I think that's the part I would like to express in this.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think, and I've written about it in other places, but I think you raised great points around culture plays a huge part of this, both for and against, right? So you can have where we have maybe in cultures with traditional medicines, just a real lasting kind of pervasive desire to consume animals or consume wildlife, but it could also go the way that you described, Anuja, around protection and saving heritage and responding in that way. And I think that's sort of what we need to work on in terms of demand reduction, is kind of increasing what you've described there, which is really lovely, around, you know, wanting to protect a cultural heritage or a national heritage. And then, yeah, I think and we see this in other crime too, don't we? 100% that status, power can be huge drivers and motivators for people committing crime. And it might not have nothing to do with economics and socioeconomics, as you said. So yeah, I think that's a great thing to touch on around people committing crime for other reasons. And yeah, status and power are a huge part of it. And you're right about, it seems you're alluding to about a bit of corruption in those upper levels of organizations getting away with it because maybe it's donors or governments looking the other way or governments benefiting from it. So yeah, and that's why in some spaces it's really hard to tackle, because you have these powerful people controlling so much of it. So thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, no, I think it is a different aspect of considering. Mm-hmm. Generally, it was always the same phenomena where we considered like it must be it is the economic factor. Yeah. But yeah, like you said, you know, it's like not always economic factor. There are other reasons also.
Mm-hmm.
And more comments? Perhaps from our students of criminology. It is last lecture of this semester, so take the floor. Well, this silence kills me. It is a very popular expression from me. This silence kills me, but what do you think about these topics? Does anyone have a comment, please?
I've just put my email in the chat too, if anyone has any questions later or thoughts, yeah, do get in touch. I'm always happy to hear from people. And yeah.
Perhaps someone in this room is shy, so he or she can send you a message afterwards. Okay, I don't know if we can put an end in this session and go to the library, to the internet, reading lots of this stuff, because we need to collect more information about this. So Rita, can you say some words, final words? But meanwhile, I thank you very much, Tanya, for being with us this period of your day. It was very, very good to hear from you and to discuss these important things. But as you said, the dark figure is very, very big because there are no victims, direct victims, but society is a very important victim in this kind of world. Thank you very much. Rita.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Fabiola. That's very kind of you.
Yeah, we're still having very, very positive comments to Tanya's talk. For me, it's always a pleasure. I've been somehow interacting with Tanya in projects that we want to, yes, fingers crossed, projects that we really want to make them happen. And if that happens, I know that the collaboration between the School of Criminology and Northumbria, particularly Tanya, will bring very interesting results, not only especially for Portugal, let's say, because Portugal does really have a lack of research on environmental crimes and harms. So we need these kinds of studies here. We need more people to pay attention to them. And we can only do that by learning from and with the best. So Tanya, thank you so much for accepting this invitation. Thank you all, the participants, for being here. Obrigada a todos e a todas por terem estado presentes. Espero que tenham aproveitado. I hope you enjoyed it. I also left the link of the university in the chat box if you want to follow our events. And other than that, it's see you soon, hopefully. A farewell to everybody. Obrigada a todos por estarem presentes. Até breve. And thank you so much, Tanya, for coming again. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again. Thanks for having me.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.